Welcome to another deep dive here where we like to take you through a stack of sources and really find those key points and those insights to make you seriously well-informed about a new topic each week.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this week we're diving into a really fascinating corner of early Christianity that's not always on top of people's minds, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, right. And so we're talking about early Syriac Christianity, and we've got excerpts from the early bishops of Edessa to guide us through.
Excellent source materials. Lots to unpack there.
Yeah, we've got a really good mix too, right? We've got a preface to set the scene, some lectures that really explore the early bishops and the kind of theology that was developing in that context. And then we've got discussions of some, really interesting texts like the Doctrine of Edessa and the Acts of Thomas.
Got some real gems in there.
Yeah. So our mission on this deep dive is to uncover some of the more surprising and kind of distinctive features of this early Christian tradition, things that you might not think of right away when you think about the beginnings of Christianity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think what makes this so interesting is that we're seeing a form of early Christianity that was definitely part of the wider church, but developed its own very unique character.
Right.
And it really, I think, serves as a reminder that, the early church wasn't this single unified entity,
Yeah.
but rather this incredibly vibrant and diverse landscape of beliefs and practices.
Right, like a whole spectrum.
Absolutely.
Not just a single point.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's jump into this. And I think a good place to start is, why is understanding this history so important in the first place? And our source really emphasizes this right from the beginning, especially, I think, for folks connected to the Church of England.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here is this argument for what's called the historical method when it comes to studying religion.
Okay.
Right? And the basic idea is that Christianity isn't just, a set of abstract philosophical ideas. It's an organic growth. It's deeply rooted in a long and evolving historical process.
Yeah, like a living tradition, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So, think about things like how much emphasis is put on the continuity of the church,
Yeah.
the historic episcopates. These concepts really rely on understanding how things actually developed and were passed down through time, right? Like you said, a living organism with its roots and its branches spreading over centuries.
Right, yeah. It's about tracing that lineage and how things unfolded. But our source also brings up this really interesting point about the limitations of looking at history in this way.
Yeah, and it brings up this really crucial question that, while the historical method can show us how the church did develop it, also sort of by its very nature highlights that, history isn't this completely predetermined path.
Right.
Right. We can only look back and see the choices that were made, the directions that were taken.
Yeah.
What if a different theological perspective like Arianism had, won out, so to speak,
Right.
instead of the views that eventually became what we consider orthodox?
Right.
I mean, we can speculate, but we'll never truly know what that alternative Christian landscape might have looked like. And it reminds us that, history, even religious history, involves, a degree of contingency. Things could have gone differently.
Absolutely. So much is sort of, up in the air, even looking back. It's hard to say what would have happened if things had gone another way.
Exactly.
So with that in mind, let's zoom in on early Syriac Christianity itself.
Okay.
What were the key things that made it stand out as something distinct, something unique?
Well, Edessa, which was also known by its ancient name Ur-Hai, this was a hugely important early center for Christianity.
Okay.
And it was very strategically positioned along this major trade route.
Oh, so really a crossroads, right?
A real crossroads, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And, what's particularly striking about Edessa is its claim to a really early origin, even going back to the apostles themselves.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so the tradition there holds that Christianity was brought to Edessa, incredibly early on.
Right, from the very beginning.
Yeah, almost from the very beginning. And while they did maintain communion with major Christian centers like Antioch and Rome, our source really emphasizes that, there was a real difference in character between the Church of Edessa and, say, the churches of the Mediterranean world.
Right, so like a difference in its fundamental nature almost.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also quite interesting that even with those connections to those larger centers and later attempts to, achieve external unity, Syriac Christendom eventually developed its own internal divisions as well.
Right, even with those attempts to unify it, still fragmented in a way.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, I think this really points to kind of a recurring theme in religious history, right? This constant tension between the desire for a unified identity
Right.
and then the persistent reality of diverse interpretations and evolving beliefs within any large movement, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into some of the more specific details about early Syriac Christianity. And I think one of the most captivating parts of the story has to be this legend of King Abgar. It sounds like something straight out of, an ancient historical novel or something.
It really does capture the imagination, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So the story goes that King Abgar Ukama, who ruled in the 1st century AD, he sent this delegation all the way to Jesus in Palestine.
Wow.
And having heard about, all of Jesus's miraculous deeds, Abgar had come to believe that Jesus was either God himself or the Son of God.
Okay, so pretty important figure.
Yeah, a very important figure.
Yeah.
So he sends this letter inviting Jesus to come to Edessa to heal him from some kind of illness.
Wow. So what was Jesus's reply? Did he accept the royal invitation and head eastward?
Not in person,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
So according to the account, Jesus responds to Hanan, who was the notary who carried Abgar's letter.
Okay.
And commends Abgar for believing in him, without having seen him directly perform miracles. But explains that, his own mission in that region was nearing its end and he would soon, return to his father.
Right.
But he does promise to send one of his disciples to Edessa after his ascension
Okay.
to heal Abgar and to bring eternal life to his people, and even offered a blessing of protection upon the city, against any future enemies.
Oh, wow. That's quite a promise.
Yeah, a really significant promise. And what's fascinating is, this whole exchange of letters, it really seems to have taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, it's become almost its own story, right?
Exactly. It was translated into Greek very early on. And incredibly, copies of the letters themselves were even inscribed on a lintel that was discovered in Ephesus,
Wow.
which dates back to around the time of Eusebius,
Yeah.
the 4th century.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also mentions of, Greek papyrus fragments that contain the narrative as well.
Really? So there's evidence that it was circulating pretty widely.
Yeah, really widely. And then in a detail that's almost, charmingly anachronistic.
Yeah.
The letter of Christ was even considered to be, like a protective amulet in England centuries later.
Wow.
Like it would copied out and worn as a charm against all sorts of dangers.
Yeah, so it went from this, royal correspondence to like a medieval good luck charm.
Exactly. A real testament to its enduring power.
Wow. And the story doesn't even end there, right? Because there's also this intriguing mention of an image of Jesus as well.
Yes, so the Doctrine of Edessa claims that Hanan, the royal notary we were talking about, he also painted a likeness of Jesus
Okay.
and brought it back with him to Edessa. And King Abgar is said to have, received this image with great honor and placed it in a very prominent position.
So this would have been a very, very early depiction of Jesus.
Extremely early. And this image became the focus of many legends later on and played a really significant role in the development of icon veneration in some traditions.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so we've got this legendary exchange of letters, this miraculous image. Now let's get into some of the actual historical figures who were really instrumental in shaping Christianity in Edessa.
Okay.
So who are the key early leaders that we should know about?
Well, tradition holds that Addai was the apostle who first brought Christianity to Edessa,
Okay.
fulfilling Jesus' promise to King Abgar. And interestingly, the Doctrine of Addai portrays his death as being very peaceful.
Okay.
But his successor, Aggai, faced a very different end. He was reportedly martyred under one of Abgar's sons, Manu, because he refused to create a pagan diadem for him.
Oh, wow. So a real contrast in their fates.
A very stark contrast. And it kind of brings to this question about, the reliability of the early historical records and the succession of bishops in Edessa.
Right, because if we've got these conflicting accounts, how do we know what to trust?
Exactly. And we have these different sources like the Doctrine of Addai and the Chronicum Edessinum, and they offer accounts that don't always align perfectly.
Right.
The Chronicum Edessinum, for instance, lists 3 bishops as succeeding Adaiazani, Histas, and Aquae, these names that are largely absent from other historical accounts.
So it's like we're missing pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly. And even a later chronicler like Michael presents this kind of confused and inconsistent list, which makes it really challenging for historians to reconstruct a definitive early episcopal lineage with absolute certainty.
Right, so it's almost like, piecing together these fragmented archaeological pieces, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Trying to figure out what goes where and what the full picture might have been.
Yeah, real detective work.
But there does seem to be a significant turning point with a figure named Palut.
Yeah, absolutely. Palut's ordination as Bishop of Edessa by Serapion, who was the Bishop of Antioch, this is widely seen as a pivotal moment.
Okay.
Because it really firmly linked Edessa's episcopal succession to the wider more established structures of the church, particularly in Antioch.
So it's bringing it into closer alignment with the broader Christian world.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it kind of brought Edessa into that fold and solidified this practice of an unbroken line of bishops,
Right.
And interestingly, Michael, the chronicler, despite all of his efforts to list these early bishops, he completely overlooks this rather crucial event.
Really?
Yeah, which might suggest that, his account wasn't based on the most reliable or independent information.
Interesting. Okay, so it sounds like Palut's ordination really marked this new chapter of connection for Edessa within this larger Christian landscape.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about another really foundational aspect of Syriac Christianity, and that's its Bible, which is known as the Peshitta. And our source really emphasizes how important this is.
Yeah, the Peshitta is really a monumental achievement. It represents this very early and highly authoritative version of the Bible that was translated into Syriac.
Okay.
We have manuscript evidence dating back to the 5th century.
Wow.
And by the 6th century, the entire Old and New Testaments, including some of the apocryphal books, existed in Syriac.
So this is pretty early on in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, incredibly early. Only Greek really has a comparable textual history that stretches back to such an early period.
Wow.
And the Peshitta became this real cornerstone of Syriac liturgical and theological life.
Right, it was foundational to their faith and practice.
Absolutely.
And there was an early claim made about the Syriac language itself in relation to the Bible, right?
Yeah, so when the Peshitta New Testament was first printed in the 16th century in Europe, the editor made this claim that the Syriac of the Peshitta was actually the language spoken in Palestine by Jesus and his apostles themselves.
Oh, wow. So the language of Jesus himself.
Exactly, that was the claim. However, while Syriac and the Aramaic dialects spoken in Palestine during Jesus' time are definitely related, they're kind of like cousins within the same language family.
Okay.
Syriac was specifically the dialect that developed in the region of the Euphrates Valley and surrounding areas.
Oh, a little bit different.
A little bit different, yeah. So while related, it wasn't precisely the language that Jesus spoke.
So close, but not quite the same.
Right, exactly.
What about the possibility of even earlier Syriac biblical translations that might have existed before the Peshitta as we know it?
Yeah, that's a really intriguing question. And there are some indications from the writings of early Syriac authors that earlier, less standardized Syriac versions of parts of the New Testament probably did exist.
Okay.
But unfortunately, these earlier versions haven't survived in any complete form, except for a few gospel texts that show some variations from the later Peshitta.
Right.
So, our knowledge of these potential earlier translations for books beyond the Gospels, it really relies mainly on these scattered quotations that we find in the works of early Syriac theologians,
Okay.
like Aphraates and the commentaries of St. Ephraim, whose commentary on Paul's epistles survives mostly in an Armenian translation.
Gotcha. So it's like we're catching these glimpses of an earlier draft through like fragments and references.
Exactly. It's like trying to piece together, a lost manuscript from these little snippets and allusions.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so speaking of early Syriac theologians, our deep dive would definitely be incomplete without a discussion of Aphraates, who's often referred to as the Persian sage.
Absolutely. Aphraates, who was active in the 4th century, he's a really crucial figure in the development of Syriac Christian thought.
Okay.
And his collection of 22 homilies and then a later 23rd one. These are considered the earliest substantial and systematic exposition of Christian faith that were written in Syriac.
So a really important body of work.
Huge, yeah. And what's kind of unique is that these homilies weren't just, a collection of sermons. They were actually structured as a comprehensive response to this inquiry about the Christian faith.
Oh, wow.
Right. The first 22 homilies corresponding to the letters of the Syriac alphabet.
Oh, that's interesting. So very deliberate and structured.
A remarkably organized presentation, yeah.
Yeah. So what were some of the central themes in Aphraates' theology? What were some of the things he really focused on?
Well, one really central theme for Aphraates is the absolute importance of faith. But for him, faith wasn't simply an intellectual agreement with certain doctrines.
Right.
It was this deeply transformative force that involved righteous living and this continuous striving to become a dwelling place for the Spirit of the Messiah.
So it's about embodying that faith.
Exactly. Yeah, he emphasized that practices like fasting, prayer, acts of love, and humility, maintaining purity.
Yeah.
These were all integral and necessary expressions of a genuine life of faith.
So really a very holistic understanding of what faith meant.
Right. It was faith in action, not just belief in theory.
That's fascinating. What about his understanding of the Trinity that was, a developing doctrine in the 4th century?
Yeah, and what's really interesting here is Aphraates' Trinitarian language. It reflects some of the older linguistic and theological traditions within Syriac Christianity.
Right.
So unlike Greek, in the Semitic languages, including Syriac, the word for spirit, ru, is grammatically feminine. So consequently, in much older Syriac literature, including some very early versions of biblical texts, the Holy Spirit is actually referred to using feminine pronouns and imagery.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
And Aphraates' writings still reflect this usage. And he often ascribes feminine qualities and descriptions to the Holy Spirit.
So a very different way of thinking about the Trinity than what we might be used to.
Right, and I think it offers this really fascinating glimpse into the diverse ways that the Trinity was conceived and expressed in these early Christian traditions.
Yeah, really highlighting that diversity that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
And what about his understanding of Christ? How did Aphraates think about Jesus?
Aphraates really strongly emphasizes Christ as the Messiah, the Son of God, and as this tangible presence of the divine within humanity.
Okay.
He draws extensively from the Old Testament, using all sorts of figures and titles like Moses, Israel's firstborn son, Joshua, David, the prophets,
Right.
to illustrate Christ's multifaceted role in salvation history.
Okay, so kind of pulling from all of these different threads of tradition.
Exactly, and he sees Christ as the essential foundation upon which all true and lasting faith must be built.
So a really central figure.
Absolutely.
Now, our sources also touch on some more unusual and maybe less mainstream texts that emerged from this Syriac context. And one of those is the Acts of Judas Thomas.
Yes.
And this sounds quite different from what we've been discussing so far.
The Acts of Thomas is definitely a striking and quite unique work.
Okay.
It's almost like a religious adventure novel.
Okay.
Centered around the Apostle Thomas, who, as tradition holds, brought Christianity to India.
Right.
And while some of the miracle stories and legends within the Acts might have older origins and circulated independently, the Acts as a whole presents this very distinctive narrative and theological perspective.
So what makes it so unlike the other early Christian writings that we typically encounter?
Well, one of the most peculiar aspects is its very consistent portrayal of Judas Thomas as the literal twin brother of Jesus himself.
Whoa, okay, so not just a follower, but like an actual twin.
An actual twin, yeah. And throughout the Acts, various characters, even demonic figures, they mistake one for the other.
Oh, wow.
And they'll frequently address Thomas as twin of the Messiah.
So almost like a divine doppelganger, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating.
And this unusual motif, it's led scholars to speculate about possible connections to these earlier beliefs in divine twins that were present in the broader cultural landscape at the time.
Okay, so there could be some interesting influences going on there.
Yeah, definitely.
So what kind of stories unfold in the Acts of Thomas? What are some of the key events?
Well, the narrative is largely episodic. It focuses on Thomas's miraculous deeds, his successes in converting people to Christianity, and the various forms of opposition that he encounters.
Okay.
One particularly famous episode recounts how Thomas is commissioned to build this magnificent palace in heaven for King Gundafar.
Okay.
But instead of undertaking this earthly construction, Thomas actually uses the king's funds to provide for the poor, and explains that these acts of charity are actually laying the foundations for the true eternal palace that awaits in the afterlife.
Oh, that's interesting. So kind of inverting expectations there.
Right. A very unconventional take on royal patronage.
Yeah. Yeah. More of a spiritual investment strategy.
Exactly. Yeah.
And our source mentions that the Acts of Thomas is often considered somewhat unorthodox in its perspective.
Yeah.
So what contributes to that assessment?
Well, several factors. I think one is that the Acts of Thomas operates with this significant degree of independence from the other apostles.
Okay.
Thomas seems to have this very direct and almost exclusive relationship with the divine.
Right.
And then the concept of the church as this structured institution, it appears relatively infrequently in the text.
Okay.
And there's also this noticeable lack of engagement with, theological debates or scriptural arguments based on the Old Testament, which were really central to a lot of early Christian discourse during this period. Instead, the Acts of Thomas places this greater emphasis on direct, personal, and often mystical experiences of the divine.
So a different focus, a different emphasis.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then embedded within this already unusual text, we have this beautifully poetic hymn of the soul.
Yeah, the Hymn of the Soul is really remarkable. It's this completely self-contained poem that we find within the narrative of the Acts of Thomas.
Okay.
And it tells this allegorical story of this young prince who is sent from his home in the east to Egypt to retrieve this precious pearl that's guarded by this dangerous serpent.
Oh, wow. So much symbolism going on there.
Oh, it's rich in symbolism, yeah. And while in Egypt, he forgets his true identity and his original mission. But eventually he receives a letter from his parents, reminding him of his purpose.
Okay.
He successfully obtains the pearl, and he returns home where he's reunited with his, glorious royal robe.
So what's the generally accepted interpretation of this hymn?
Well, the hymn is widely interpreted as representing the soul's journey through the material world, which is symbolized by Egypt, and its forgetting of its divine origin and its true purpose. The struggles and temptations that it faces in this foreign land and its eventual awakening and return to its heavenly home, carrying the pearl of spiritual knowledge or enlightenment.
Right. So this idea of leaving and then returning and finding that true self again.
Exactly.
That's beautiful. And there are some interesting connections to the Parthian cultural context, right?
Yeah, there's some strong linguistic and thematic connections to the Parthian world. And some scholars have even proposed the possibility that the early Syriac Gnostic thinker Bargaison as its author.
Okay.
But regardless of its precise origins, it offers this really profound reflection on the human condition and this yearning for spiritual reunion.
Yeah, it sounds like, so it's this fascinating glimpse into a spirituality that has connections to Gnostic thought, but it's expressed in this distinctly Syriac way, right? Prioritizing this direct symbolic revelation over, historical narratives.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to another really distinctive characteristic of early Syriac Christianity, and that's its early emphasis on asceticism.
Yeah, this is a really notable feature. Early Syriac Christianity displayed this strong inclination towards ascetic practices.
Okay.
And, some interpretations of the Gospels led to the view that marriage was actually incompatible with achieving the highest levels of spiritual life and devotion.
Wow. Okay.
And this wasn't a universally held belief, but it was a significant current within these early Syriac communities.
And Aphraates, the Persian sage that we discussed earlier, he seems to have held a very specific view on the structure of the Christian community in relation to this ascetic ideal, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Aphraates envisioned this ideal Christian community that was primarily composed of baptized celibates who were known as the B'nai Ki Imd, which translates to sons of the covenant or children of the covenant.
Okay.
And these individuals, they dedicated themselves to a life of rigorous spiritual discipline and purity.
So kind of like a monastic ideal almost.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
And alongside this core group, Aphraates also acknowledged this separate category of adherents who weren't celibate and who hadn't made that same, formal commitment.
Right.
And his writings even suggest that those who intended to marry should ideally do so before undergoing baptism.
Oh, wow.
Implying that the fully initiated Christian life was best lived in this state of continence.
So a very different social structure for the early church than what we often imagine.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's fascinating. This idea of like a core of spiritual elites alongside this broader group of believers.
Right.
But it sounds like this intense focus on asceticism evolved over time as Christianity became more widespread.
It did, yeah. As Christianity expanded and became more integrated into the broader social fabric, that earlier emphasis on celibacy as the defining characteristic of the fully committed Christian, it began to gradually shift.
Right.
And later influential figures like Bishop Rabbula, he found it necessary to introduce these canons and regulations aimed at guiding the lives of these sons and daughters of the covenant. Within this larger Christian population that increasingly included married individuals and families.
Right. So it's moving from a community that's primarily defined by its ascetic members to a more inclusive church that accommodates a wider range of lifestyles.
Exactly.
So a real shift happening there.
Yeah. And the eventual development and formalization of marriage services within the Syriac-Speaking Church, I think, further illustrates this significant social and theological evolution.
Yeah, so they're adapting to these changing circumstances.
Right.
Okay, so finally we need to talk about the figure of Bardasan, who seems to have been this really influential yet ultimately controversial intellectual within early Syriac Christianity.
Yeah, Bardasan was a truly significant intellectual force in early Syriac Christianity. He's best known for his dialogue on fate.
Okay.
And in this work, he really grapples with these complex philosophical questions surrounding the interplay between, natural forces, which he calls nature, destiny, fate, and the capacity for human freedom, free will.
Right. So these big questions that people are still grappling with today.
Exactly. Yeah, and what were his main arguments in this intellectual exploration?
Well, he argued that while human lives are undoubtedly influenced by these external factors, like our inherent nature and the circumstances, we're born into which he termed fate.
Right.
Right. Individuals, nevertheless, retain this fundamental responsibility for their moral choices.
Okay, so we're not just puppets of fate.
Right, exactly. He firmly believed in the existence of human free will, asserting that people have the power to act against what might seem to be these predetermined outcomes.
And that's a really powerful idea.
It is, and interestingly, he even pointed to the transformative effects of Christian faith on individuals' character as empirical evidence for this freedom.
Oh.
He argued that, people demonstrably change their behavior and break free from negative patterns once they embrace the Christian faith.
So that was part of his argument for free will.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yet, despite his evident engagement with Christian thought, he was eventually excommunicated from the mainstream church. So what were the reasons behind this? Well, it likely stemmed from his independent and perhaps somewhat unconventional approach to theological questions.
Yeah, okay.
He was willing to engage deeply with these philosophical ideas and consider empirical observations of the natural world in his thinking, rather than just strictly adhering to these established doctrinal formulas.
So a mind that was maybe too inquisitive or too willing to explore beyond those conventional boundaries of thought.
Perhaps, yeah. And our source draws this interesting parallel to the later case of the modern Catholic theologian Aphraates.
Okay.
Suggesting this kind of recurring tension throughout religious history between, established religious authority and the spirit of intellectual inquiry.
Right, that push and pull that's always present.
Exactly. And Bardeson's apparent reluctance to just dismiss natural facts or philosophical reasoning in favor of purely dogmatic pronouncements,
right.
That likely led to conflict with church leaders who prioritized doctrinal conformity.
So it really paints this picture of early Syriac Christianity as a vibrant and intellectually dynamic environment.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You've got all this theological debate. You've got these unique texts emerging. You've got these figures like Bardeson pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, it's not just this monolithic thing, right? It's a living tradition that's full of debate and change.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it really makes you think, how do these ancient tensions, push and pull between tradition and innovation, between, individual spiritual paths and communal norms that we've seen in early Syriac Christianity, how do those continue to resonate in both religious and secular contexts today?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think exploring these early debates and the unique expressions of faith in Syriac Christianity can really offer some valuable perspectives on a lot of the issues that we're facing today.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important to remember that these tensions that we see in history, they're not just, things of the past. They're very much alive and well in our own time. Yeah, so we encourage you, our listener, to delve even deeper into these primary sources and the ongoing scholarly research on early Syriac Christianity, to continue this really fascinating exploration on your own.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much more to discover.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you've gained a new appreciation for this really fascinating corner of early Christian history. Until next time on The Deep Dive.
Take care.